It's your audience. It's your audience, Jeannie.
We need some more.
Okay.
We need some walks. Well,
Let's come.
dear. The thing is, I need some nicotine because I've forgotten everything I'm going to say.
I don't need to remember anything
No, you
whenever it comes out.
Yeah, I'm a bit like that, but I feel a bit strange.
It will come out okay because
Well, invite
I've been waiting for so long. It's like I've been waiting for so long. It will be like premature ejaculation.
Did you drink something before? Did you drink any wine before coming here? Remember, we're talking about the cigarette. And nicotine.
Don't get the topic mixed up.
It's awful being able to see this.
Start thinking about what I'm going to say.
There's a bit of pudding.
I feel like we're on the one show.
I get that a few
Be
times
careful of the live stream. I don't even know what it is.
previous speakers.
You're introducing them, they call
I
them.
find my glasses.
Yeah. Oh, I thought so.
And my opening statement will be about trust.
Is that too shy?
No, we should have informed our people. Managing director.
Trust.
It's a good turnout considering it's
Not
the
bad,
radio.
not bad.
That's really.
It's not very exciting.
Anyway, I suppose it will also be recorded and available online. Yeah?
And people that are preoccupied with being trusted are not to be trusted.
So I don't feel like this.
You always say such. When do you go home?
Tomorrow. Monday to back to Zimbabwe. A million hours of flying. Ready? Is this on? Yeah, I think so.
Start.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Survivors Party. Well done if you made it this far. There's plenty of casualties strewn around the hotel from last night and earlier. So this is a session, it's going to be all about you the audience, okay? This is our big audience participation session. But we have got a panel for you to interact with, to disagree with, to criticize, to undermine, to mock. Whatever you want to do, it's up to you. You're leading this session. So I want everybody thinking, what is the question I want to ask? What is the point I want to make? You know, what do I need to say in this audience? We also want to draw on some of the speakers that we had earlier today because there wasn't enough time, frankly, for audience questions. So I'm going to probably pick at random if anyone's still in here and get them to answer some of the questions. If you would like to answer a question that comes up, put your hand up and answer it, okay? The only rule is be brief. Be respectful of the time of others. Get straight to the point. Be concise, okay? I'm Clive Bates. I'm one of the co-moderators of this event.
Hi, I'm Sharon Cox. I think some of you know me from last year, some of you don't. I'm a research fellow at London South Bank University Centre for Addictive Behaviours Research. My research, just so you know where I come from, covers smoking in vulnerable and deprived groups. That consists mostly of homeless adults in London. I'm also interested in puffin topography work with reduced harm products, so I think it's important to know how different groups use these products. And I also am doing some work with some colleagues at South Bank on TPD health warning labels and the unintended consequences of and possible alternatives to.
We have a distinguished panel. Greg Wilson from Altria, Managing Director of Regulatory Affairs. Kgosi Letlape, who's the sort of leading light of the health and medical establishment in South Africa, former President of South African Medical Association and a leading light in the World Medical Association. Jeannie Cameron, who is a consultant and sort of strategy and advocacy expert with a particular specialization in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and WHO and the legal order that surrounds that. And then finally, probably needs no introduction, Konstantinos Farsalinos, probably the busiest researcher of all time, the most hyperactive man that I have ever met, which is saying something, has made just an outstanding contribution to this field with the research he's done, most recently some of the replication studies. I mean, a great guy, tends to talk a bit too much, but that's my job, to keep that under control. Okay, so we're going to just start off, we're going to go through the panel, everyone's going to give a...
Can I just add, bear in mind, I'm one of these people that normally sits there and let everybody else talk. This is your last chance to ask questions for a year. So if you've got any doubts or somebody said something that's vague or irritating, please, please put your hand up. I want to make sure that, especially those people that don't usually get to ask questions, get to ask their questions, have their doubts answered, and also get to answer some questions, perhaps, yeah? So please don't be shy.
We might even pick on people and make them ask questions at random.
So
like
put your hand up, because we'll otherwise...
You need to have a question ready.
The microphones move.
Ask,
exactly.
Okay.
So please participate.
So we're going to get 5 minutes each, opening sort of introductory remarks from our distinguished panel. And then we'll go into like a structured discussion. So what we're going to do, we're going to cover 3 aspects of the subject matter that we've had in the conference so far. First thing we're going to, the theme is rethinking nicotine. So what is it? What is this thing that we're rethinking? What is addiction? What is dependence? Where does pleasure fit? You know, all of that sort of cluster of issues. The second thing we want to discuss is what's the optimum policy framework for managing this as we go forward, okay? And given what we've seen has been done so far, and you probably all know my views on that since it's what I presented on the last 2 GFNs, what are the unintended consequences? What's going wrong? Where are we making mistakes? And then finally, we want to just discuss the politics. Why is this proving so difficult? On the face of it, it should be a really simple issue, but why is it proving so difficult? Why is there so much friction? Why is there so much conflict over these issues? Let's try and get into that and understand what's going on. All of those themes kind of capture the discussion that we've had in the conference over the last 2 days. So anyone who's been a speaker or anyone who's wanted to ask a question and get to it, now's your chance. So, without further ado, 5 minutes from Greg.
Great, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. 5 minutes. Can you hear me? 5 minutes is a tall order, so I will jump right into it. As I think about where we are from a nicotine perspective, I think we really just need to focus on the tobacco harm reduction opportunity that's right in front of us right now. Certainly from a U.S. perspective, we operate under the authority of the FDA, as you all know. We need look no further than what FDA had to say a little less than a year ago in July of 2017 to understand how that framework is shaping up in the United States. As you know, they announced a comprehensive plan on tobacco and nicotine, and they really made several really, I think, important statements as part of that announcement. So for the very first time, as a leading regulator in the U.S., they acknowledge that it's not the nicotine, but rather the combustion that causes harm from tobacco products. And they also endorsed the continuum of risk, something that we certainly advocated for a long time, and no doubt a number of you advocated for them to adopt as well to inform their regulatory decision making. I think that those were critical aspects of the announcement in 2017. They also really focused on the misperceptions that exist with respect to nicotine. And what they really did with this package that they announced and this plan that they announced was they really put, in my view, nicotine kind of in the center of the plate and changed the dynamic a bit about the conversation in the U.S. with respect to nicotine and drew a divide between combustible versus non-combustible. And they identified that there is a place, there is a role for non-combustible nicotine-containing products. I think that's very important, and it changes the dynamics a bit of the conversation, certainly. And they've laid out this framework that they envision that they will pursue. And they really also talked about a number of other important things as part of that package, including clarity around the pathways to get products into market. Those pathways are not clearly defined. We're 9 years in and there are not clear definitions. And I'm sure chief among them for FDA will be the pathway for pre-market applications or to a standard of appropriate for the protection of public health, and rules around what a manufacturer needs to demonstrate in order to achieve an MRTP claim and to be able to make a claim of reduced risk with respect to a product. They, of course, announced a number of other actions that they intend to take, some of which they've initiated through advanced notices of proposed rulemaking with respect to nicotine reduction in cigarettes and flavors and other tobacco products. But again, the harm reduction opportunity in the US is right in front of us right now. We know that we have 20 million adult smokers who have already indicated their interest in alternative, innovative options to cigarette smoking. And that opportunity for harm reduction really isn't limited to just manufacturers. It's an opportunity right now for the regulator. It's an opportunity for the public health community as well. And I think as we think about that kind of framework, one thing that I have heard here for the last couple of days, which I was encouraged by, was that the consumer's in the conversation, and I think that's really critically important. We need to keep the consumer top of mind with respect to these policy actions that are being considered all around the world, but of course in the US specifically. And what I mean by that is consumers need choice. We've heard it here a number of times over the last couple of days. There's not a one-size-fits-all to what kind of non-combustible products may be appealing to different consumers. So we need to think about the consumer's preference and interests and think about choice. The regulatory framework that's begun to emerge post this announcement by FDA last year really is science and evidence-based. It needs to be science and evidence-based, whether that's for evaluating a manufacturer's application for a product or evaluating a product standard that the agency may consider as part of its comprehensive plan. And the other aspects of that framework really are understanding the consumer's interests and preferences and what they're really looking for so that we can try to meet that. Really fostering a regulatory and business environment that really encourages the development of reduced risk products. And of course, generating the science to demonstrate that reduced risk are all critical aspects of the framework that's shaping up and that we need to shape up. And certainly a framework that has viable pathways, clearly defined pathways, and viable pathways to get products into the market, and the truthful and accurate communications about those products are another critical aspect. We've talked a lot about that over the last couple of days. I'll just remind you that we have government data in the US, the FDA's own PATH data, that shows that 90% of current adult tobacco users in the US believe that smokeless products are as or more harmful than cigarette smoking, and nearly half of adult tobacco consumers in the US believe that e-vapor products are as or more harmful than cigarette smoking. And in my view, just to wrap up, I think the single greatest thing that FDA should be focusing on right now in the US with respect to this plan that they have announced is really to create a market of alternative non-combustible products, get products authorized, get them into the market, have an array of products that are available for consumers to choose from, and to provide clear and accurate information about those products so that consumers can make informed choices. I think only when we have that mature, kind of robust category of alternative products can then we begin to think about making progress on some of the other issues that are part of the FDA's comprehensive plan. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Greg. And the next panelist.
Thank you for the invite, and I'll speak as a healthcare practitioner. But I thought maybe it might be prudent to talk about issues that we spoke about yesterday, where there was an issue about trust. And my contention is that I don't trust you, but I'll talk to you. Talking to someone you trust is like talking to your pastor or kissing your grandmother. Not very exciting. And being a healthcare practitioner, I'll talk about the trust issues. The sum total of education about smoking is about how bad it is and that smoking kills. And there's nothing about nicotine. And it's done from a moral position, and it's something you're told by people you trust, your professors. And that's why trust needs to be taken out, and everything should be based on evidence. And we need to question people in terms of statements that they make. So part of the challenge for healthcare professionals is that That's our background, and that's the information that we have about smoking. And in the country that I come from, the tax on smoking is called a sin tax. So we're dealing with sinners. And unlike in HIV, the smokers smoke. The great thing about the virus is that it started in gay men, in sex workers, but then it then migrated to presidents, popes, pastors, and was not discriminating. And because it affected everyone, and the patients stood up, we needed to change the paradigm around how we look at it. Because of the way smokers are viewed, it's difficult to change that paradigm. And that's why you have a subset of people that call themselves vapers, and they found a voice, thankfully. The other issue for me coming from Africa is that we should ensure that harm reduction, our challenge is to decolonize harm reduction. So it should not be seen from the perspective of the occupier or affluent countries or OECD countries. We should look at it from our perspective, from our reality, and be mindful of the fact that harm reduction does not equal e-cigarettes. Harm reduction is much broader than e-cigarettes. And there are things that are tried and tested, like smokeless tobacco, that is culturally acceptable, that has its own virtues, and that has its appeal for low-income countries. Even if you do not have access to electricity, you can have access to less harmful products. They are also organic. They are environmentally friendly. And there are lots of things that could be said about them. So part of the issue is that harm reduction can't just be about e-cigarettes or electronics. There has to be conventional ways in which people can enjoy their nicotine and still find ways that it is less harmful. And I was encouraged that Dr. Russell spoke about snus but abandoned it and got to the nicotine and alternative nicotine. So we need to ensure that the basics are not thrown out so that you do not have the masses left behind. There's also the cost issues, which are real for us in Africa. You know, getting your nicotine, you're competing with food. So even the cheapest forms of electronics might not be affordable to the poor who'd be dependent on it. So we need to ensure that there's, across LSMs, people have access to what will work for them and what might be promoted. Now, the third issue is that our biggest problem in Africa is that we think the WHO is God. And God seems to be smoking something which has a delirious effect on Africa. So I'm appealing to all of you that some of you are relatives of God and you need to help us reach God and talk to him to be sensible, or talk to her to be sensible, because it's resulting in legislative frameworks that are very prescriptive, that are based on the gospel according to the WHO. In our country, smoke is being defined as anything that you can inhale or exhale. And I'd also appeal that we probably give thought to going back to talking about combustibles and non-combustibles, and that non-combustible forms of accessing nicotine are safer than combusting it, so that, you know, we don't get lost in the fog about what is smokeless, what is not smokeless.
Very good. Letlape, thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Very good, Kgosi. Next up, Jeannie Cameron.
Thank you, Clive. Okay, in terms of rethinking nicotine, I think there's various perspectives for that. And I'm going to give three perspectives, I think, of how nicotine needs to be rethought, which may be a little different to the usual ones. I think, firstly, when you think of nicotine addiction, it's not just in relation to those who are addicted to nicotine as a substance, you have to think of, and I think most importantly, that governments are actually addicted to nicotine. Because I think if you're thinking of a smoke-free world, really what you're thinking of is a world without revenue from tobacco tax. And that's a very different perspective of looking at it. If you think that most of the developed countries in the world, 5% of the government revenue comes from tobacco taxation currently, and then in the developing world, about 7%, that's a significant hole to be filled from taxation if there does become a smoke-free world from the existing situation. So it's a really important factor, because you think so many governments are dependent on taxation. Think of the Master Settlement Agreement in the US and how the states, now run their education and other things from revenue, and most countries in the world do. So I think I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's an important factor. And I think we need to look at illicit trade in that context as well. Governments already lose globally 40 billion in uncollected excise tax in 1 year, roughly. And so when you put those things together in this context, I think looking at tax policy, and David Sweener and Lynn Kozlowski and others have talked about this, is a really important thing that needs to be factored in how we can find ways when you have a product that you don't wish to tax because you want people to use it because it's less harmful, gives the governments what they're going to miss out on if that path is followed. There's lots of innovative ways, through R&D and through, clever taxation, but it is a factor. I think, and it's a sovereignty issue as well. Secondly, I think the whole regulatory and policy area and the nomenclature around the issue is really paramount. Scott Balin at the Malvern Dialogues a few years ago tried to set up a group to look at the definitions and the words around this. You just spoke, Jose, about smoke. We are all around the world using these terms interchangeably. We're meaning different things. The regulations at the moment, as we heard from Marawa yesterday about in New Zealand, it was definitions that allowed products onto the market that were old, and the world does not have, and I don't necessarily think it should have, any form of model regulation, but at least those of us who are advocating for harm reduction, we need to start using the same words that are carefully chosen to advocate for exactly what we want, so that governments who will be creating regulation don't get mixed up and messed up by all these different interpretations that cause issues of unintended consequence. And I think that Scott Balin is having another one of those in October this year, and I think that will be worthwhile for those that really look at that to try and get what we want, not just sitting back waiting for governments to try and create regulation around this, because unless we actually know what it is that we want, we can't advocate for that. And thirdly, in rethinking nicotine, I think we need to look back at the WHO and human rights and in our advocacy. The FCTC actually has a legal requirement for those governments that are parties to it, which is in excess of 180, I think now, to implement national tobacco control measures. The definition of tobacco control measures includes supply and demand and harm reduction strategies. So effectively, in implementing a tobacco control policy, a government has an obligation to implement harm reduction policies. And in that context, therefore, how we look at nicotine and harm reduction and all of those things need to be built into the way governments do, and they are ignoring that point. Again, from the FCTC, the human rights aspects are well stated but not often used. They call on the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. I think it is one of the two big 1960s human rights that says human health and the attainment of it is a human right. There are 3 references in the FCTC itself. Even the WHO Constitution requires that. Indigenous rights are included in that. And we all go on about, and everyone does, oh, Article 5.3, this, that, and the rest. but none of us ever use any of the other articles to our benefit. How many people know about Article 2A? Article 2A is a general obligation, and it says the general obligation of the treaty is the need to take measures to protect all persons from exposure to tobacco smoke. That should be a fairly simple thing. Governments have obligations to do that, so it's up to us to be pushing them to accept their obligation and help them understand that. And I think, David... Oh, okay, sorry, 5 minutes is up.
Wrap it up.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was just about to do that, actually, because the last right was consumer rights. Consumers have rights in this context as well, access and information too. And, yeah, that's it.
Very good. Perfect timing.
And on to our next panellist that's also going to show perfection in his timing, Konstantinos.
I will only be looking to the left, as you can understand. And I'm the only one who has no notes, and that's always a dangerous thing because I will not know when to stop. Anyway, rethinking about nicotine means, I think, just one thing. Accepting that people can use nicotine in a safe form through a safe product, and that it's not really that wrong. I think there is some progress in that aspect, but at the same time, we are very far away from getting there. Yesterday, I was in a conference organized by the European Network on Smoking Prevention in Madrid. It was a truly unique experience and an impressively horrifying experience for me, and I'm not easily impressed. It was a place full of scientists who, in my opinion, I don't want to insult anyone, were not really thinking of what they were saying. And I will give you some examples. People presenting as a major public health hazard the fact that examining 20 vapors from a Mediterranean country, all of the vapors were tested positive for urinary nicotine levels. And that was a huge public health hazard related to accepting the use of nicotine. People were asking to create vaping cessation clinics as if they have solved the problem of smoking, so we don't need smoking cessation clinics, we need vaping cessation clinics. Coming from a country where e-cigarettes are banned, so vaping use is basically an underground habit, and where smoking rates are going up, according to their data. So it was truly a unique but a horrifying at the same time experience, but it answered my question, why so many organizations like the WHO, again, I hope they will not feel insulted, the European Commission, the Health Commissioner, are having such unreasonable opinions and approaches to the issue of harm reduction. Because these people present in this conference are the people who are consulting the governments, who are consulting the WHO, and who are consulting the European Commission and the health officials in the European Union. And I understand now why all these organizations have this opinion. So we are far from there. I've heard through my trips all over the world several other very interesting arguments. For example, people don't need nicotine to survive. No person needs nicotine when they are born or during their lifetime. So we cannot accept anyone being addicted or dependent to nicotine. Well, in the same way that no one needs to go and have vacation with the family to survive. No one needs a nice glass of wine to survive. No one needs to eat a nice meal to survive. You can just barely survive with healthy stuff that no one wants to eat. But everyone is doing it. You know, everyone is exposed during the weekends on the risk of getting involved in a traffic accident by using your car while you don't need to use it. You're not going to your work, you're not going to do something, you're just going to have fun with friends or with family. But we do it, and we don't need it to survive. So I think this is the prospect that we need to present when we discuss about nicotine. It's a choice of some people. It doesn't matter if we recommend it or not. We may even tell them that it's not a good idea. But that's very different from depriving these people from using nicotine in a clean form. And that's definitely, in my opinion, unethical, with capital letters, to deprive smokers from an additional option to quit their smoking habit. Thanks.
History has been made here and now, exactly 5 minutes from Konstantinos.
On the second.
Give it up for him. Give it up. Give it up. Outstanding. That's never happened before. Probably never happened again. History.
It's absolutely on the second. Well done.
Outstanding. I'm just chip in a question. Let me chip in a question.
Okay.
Let me chip in a question. What is, if I'm a journalist or a politician, I come to you and I say, I don't have a lot of degrees or don't know anything about brains. What is nicotine addiction and how bad is it? Yeah, to any, you can go first if you like.
As you know, there is a big difference between addiction and dependence, and the big difference between the two is that addiction implies a risk, a substantial health risk. So I would consider nicotine use as an addiction or as a dependence, depending on the product, on the source of nicotine intake. So the big problem arose from the fact that until very recently, the only source of nicotine intake for people around the world was combustible cigarettes. And that was really bad for the health. Not because of the nicotine, but because of the combustion process and products. And that's why all this perception about nicotine has evolved over decades. Nicotine is bad because it's being obtained through smoking. And that's why it's so hard to change this well-established perception, which has become a dogma over time, because now we have products that may sustain nicotine use, but they make the addiction a dependence. And this is something that is not very clear to most of the people. And I think this is something where we should focus on and where we should discuss.
Any other views on the panel on that? Anything to add?
Well, what I would
Then we go
add
to the audience.
is that my answer would be that before you even talk about addiction, do you know what nicotine is? And probably take the opportunity to educate them about what nicotine is. Because without that education, you don't have a good base to work on. And that's part of the problem, that people don't even understand what nicotine is, and we need to go back to basics.
Okay, so we're going to take some questions.
Let's take some questions. First Maria, then Martin, then David.
And then David, yeah.
And then at the back. Is there a switch on it? Try that.
Maria Glover from New Zealand, and we're on now, thank you. Yeah, I would like to have a go at speaking to that question as well, and that actually was what I was going to. I wrote down what, and you jumped in there, Clive. Okay. So I just want to, I think one thing is it's really, really great that we have we've got people from a wider range of countries now. And in order to stay relevant to all of those countries, we need to start just being aware that of some of the dominant Anglo-Western theories underpinning much of what is talked about, including this, that nicotine is addictive, excuse my bag. So, yeah, I'm glad you raised that. So I just wanted to say that nicotine is addictive, is a culturally based construct. And it's not necessarily the situation in other cultures that they believe this. So we're largely talking here from, you know, as I said, Anglo-Western theories are underpinning everything, and I think that's what we need to rethink is and be very aware of our theoretical basis. So when people get up and talk and they say, we this and we that, you're not talking for me and my people, you're not necessarily talking for the people in the Philippines or in Japan. So when we're working globally, we need to be much more aware of that. Now, in terms of the addiction construct, just been trying to think, how can I explain this? And Joe tweeted this morning an article about an artifact in a Native American pipe, and they have dated smoking of tobacco back to 3,500 years. And this morning we heard about smoking among European people. You're looking at a tobacco history use of 100 to 200 years. So, you know, I don't mean any offence, but your naive hypotheses about why people use tobacco, you could learn a lot from cultures that have been smoking 350 years, 650 years, 3,500 years. And they don't think of tobacco as addictive. It is not addictive in those cultures. So what is it if it's not addictive? And I think that's what's been lost, which Sarah talks about, which many of the vapors talk about, and we've even talked about in tobacco control. We're forgetting the relationship that is formed. So these cultures have a relationship with tobacco that goes back centuries, and I think we can learn a lot from them.
Maria, a brief answer on this, if you would. If Maori culture doesn't think of nicotine and cigarettes as addictive, what does it? What fits in that same place?
Well, we're relatively new to tobacco use, so we're not, you know, it's only 180, 200 years. But there are some Aboriginal tribes in Northern Territory who have been smoking 350 years. Definitely, this is not the way they conceive of tobacco. They adopted tobacco, much like you would adopt a child. They've accepted it into the tribe. They have songs, they have dances celebrating their relationship with tobacco. And so you can think like, I mean, most of you probably have a relationship with a cat or a dog or, you know, your local pub, right? That's a relationship. And Sarah talked about the relationship that smoking is people's best friend. We're not talking about some isolated chemical and the effect it has on the body. It's much deeper than that. And those cultures have that.
Thanks. Sorry, can I just add something to that as well? And somebody on the panel mentioned the use of language. And I think as an academic in this field, the use of language, but the use of language amongst academics is extremely important and often gets overlooked. And the peer review process really has to get a lot better about this. Because I don't think people really understand what addiction means. And as you've eloquently stated, it changes amongst cultures, and we need to be a bit more mindful of that. But the difference between addiction and dependence, but also what we call smokers is changing, what we call nicotine users. So I review journals and people send in that they've surveyed college students who smoke, and they class them as having nicotine use disorder. What is that? So we have to clean up the language and how we categorise people. You're vapors, you're a smoker, you're a non-user, whatever. But I just, you know, I mean, I'm sure the academics here are not accepting papers where people talk about nicotine use disorder. But we don't actually have a very good grasp at all on what we're talking about. We borrow things from alcohol research or heroin research, and we just add nicotine onto it. Yeah, it's not the same thing. So I just wanted to add that.
Let's go to Martin.
Yeah, I'm going to say it's kind of the same thing. I'm an enthusiastic nicotine consumer. Basically, if a product's got nicotine in it, I'll use it. I love the stuff. it struck me, I was on the train here from the airport yesterday, and there was a woman walking along a path next to some high grass, and she blew out a cloud or something. I don't know if it was tobacco smoke or it was vape or whatever, but it seemed to me that the sun was shining, it was the most natural thing in the world. She was enjoying the nicotine that she was taking. Now, it strikes me, we always talk about addiction, and it seems tobacco control have turned it into addiction, so they say, you don't enjoy this thing. I enjoy nicotine. You know, it's an enjoyable substance. They've turned it into addiction so they can get into it and say, no, you don't enjoy it, you just addicted to it. Now, addiction is not a problem if it's not harmful. So you'll get people in offices joking about saying, I'm addicted to coffee or I'm addicted to chocolate, and everyone will laugh about it. What's the difference with nicotine if it's not harmful? How can we get back to that idea that it's a pleasurable thing? And why are we tend to be sort of fighting this war against tobacco control on their terms, where they say it's an addiction, and we want to say it's a pleasure?
So let's comments from the panel on this. I mean, there's a counter theory is that the pleasure is just the relief of craving and withdrawal. You know, it's basically the removal of the stress of going without. I mean, that's a counter. I don't believe it, but it's a counter theory.
Well, yeah, but there is, and I've spoken to quite a few of you and bought you lunch and snacks, but you know, NIDA is someone nobody talks about at this conference, but they've invested a load, millions and millions of pounds in the brain disease model of substance use and addiction, and it's stigmatising. And Martin, yesterday you were saying, why don't more consumers complain? Why isn't there a regulatory board that they can go to? Well, when you're told you're brain diseased, you lose power, and you don't think that you should be complaining, and people don't tend to listen to people that they deem as brain diseased, and the pleasure that you feel is because you're diseased.
Let's go to the panel.
Yeah.
I think there might be a cultural bias where it looks like those from the north seem convinced that it's a sin to have fun. Because even when they came with their religion to Africa, they told us you have sex to make babies, not to enjoy yourself. And it might be part of the continuum of having difficulty with being happy. And maybe we need to bring all of you to Africa just to be happy. and it might help you.
Very good, man.
To be more accepting to others and what they do to be happy. Don't be jealous, just join.
But Jeannie, what's your view on going to Africa?
No, my comment was going to be about the language again, and I think when I made the point about language and the right way to be inclusive, it wasn't so much about academic language, because academics will understand each other and have the context of all of that. What I'm talking about is, in this sense, consumers and the real people using and talking about it. I was with my brother, who was talking to the minister in Australia, and he had an IQOS with him. And I let my brother talk, and my brother said to the minister in his own words, oh, it's an e-cigarette, but it just uses tobacco. I mean, technically, that wasn't the way it's sort of, we say heat not burn and all this, but a consumer was talking about it and his feeling. And it is people and consumers that will change the laws and the views of politicians. Academic papers will help, but what I was trying to say is that in rethinking nicotine, we need to think even amongst consumers, we need to think what those ways of describing things might be the best to get politicians to listen, in order to get regulations and legislation correct that doesn't have the unintended consequence.
We want to just go on very, very quickly, but I want to move to the next question.
I'm going to directly respond to the question of whether it's pleasure or addiction. I would call it dependence versus pleasure, and I think that something which is used for pleasure can create a dependence, and the two terms are not mutually exclusive or excluding each other. However, the question is whether the public health community has an obligation to criticize, or even worse, to implement restrictions when we talk about pleasure and dependence versus addiction, which means harm. In my opinion, the public health community today is going beyond what they should be doing. They are criticizing dependence per se, even the dependence that is not associated with any harm, simply because it's dependence. And I think we have no right to do that. We can ask for measures if something causes harm to health, but we have no right to judge behaviors or lifestyle choices that don't have adverse effects on the society in terms of public health or any other issue.
Let's have a next question.
Great, David.
That's a good point, by the way.
One of the points that really resonated with me was the idea that we need to think of the panoply of potential harm reduction products out there. And in particular, I think that's an important point because usually when we hear discussions, it's about one of the products rather than the other. And now, increasingly, the smokers themselves are using many products. So it's very important to think in this broader framework. To get to a specific question, and I'll address it first to Greg Wilson, and I'm going to ask you for some marketing secrets here, if you will, and that is what. And let's begin with the context of the United States and assume that heat not burn is something that can be marketed in the United States. What do you see as the target audiences for smokeless or snus, for heat not burn, and for e-cigarettes? Do you see them competing with each other? Do you see particular market segments where they might be more effective? And also, I would like your opinion as to which, much of the issue and much of the concern is dual use, so how to get people away from smoking completely to one of these products.
Sure. So I think the idea is that there does need to be an array of products for consumers that as we have been discussing here for a couple of days, that no one product is necessarily going to meet the interests of every consumer. So I think of all of those products that you mentioned, be it smokeless or e-vapor products or even heat not burn products, as appealing to smokers and potentially different segments of smokers. And I think that that's really the focus of what we need to do. And what was the second part of your question?
Well, is there particular groups of smokers that they appeal to? Do you see some appealing to people with mental health issues, people with low income, and so on? As a particular segments, and which do you see as facilitating the transition away from dual use to exclusive use of one of the harm reduction products?
Yeah, I don't know the subsections of smokers that those different products may appeal to. I think the idea is that we need to have the variety of products out there for them to move to and to try. And with respect to dual use, I think that's one of the subjects that probably there needs to be some more conversation about in terms of most smokers, I imagine, if they're going to make the transition to an alternative product, are going to probably try several different products to find one that satisfies them, and that it's not likely that smokers would just immediately switch to a product, that there's going to be some period of transition by which they are dual using before they make that switch. But if the products are satisfying and they're permitted to be satisfying and appealing to smokers, I think that increases the chance that they will move to one of those alternative non-combustible.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions now coming in. So next question.
John, and then
Thank you.
at the back, he's been waiting.
Yeah, John.
So my question for the panel is it possible to rethink nicotine and the idea of pleasure and recreation without also rethinking the historic role of the tobacco industry in having been a supplier of that pleasure, as well as the associated problems? And do you think hostility to the industry is a barrier to clearer thinking about recreation and pleasure?
Who'd like to start on that?
Yeah. Oh, Greg.
Greg, why not?
Yeah.
Industry guy.
No, you could start as an industry person.
Let's keep the answers nice and short.
Yeah,
So
we've
we've
got
got
lots of
a few
questions.
coming up, so go for it.
I'll just say that I do think, and I've heard conversations here about distrust, and I understand historical issues that have caused that, and the concerns that has left with folks. And I've heard questions here about even funding of research, and someone said yesterday, we still need to take a close look if it's funded by the tobacco companies. What I would just say is that we're all committed to advancing harm reduction. We're out trying to talk about that. We're trying to demonstrate that through our actions. We're trying to demonstrate that through the products that we're making available. And one of the things in the US that I think is sometimes not really interjected into the conversation is that there is an arbiter of the industry's work and an arbiter of the science, and that's FDA. They've had regulatory authority for almost 10 years now. It's going on 9 years. And they can evaluate industry-based science just as much as they can evaluate anybody else's. And so I think it's important to recognize that that's part of the reason why having a regulatory infrastructure and a regulatory agency in place like that is so important. And I do think at the end of the day that the time spent on kind of the historical allegations or concerns is really time that's not spent on trying to advance the ball from a harm reduction perspective.
Anybody else? I'm going to take maybe a series of questions quite quickly now. Helen, you've grabbed the mic. Guy at the back,
And then Dan.
and then over there, and then bloke at the front.
Yeah.
So if you can make them quick to the point, that would be
Right.
great.
My question is about cannabis. Can we learn anything? And because look at cannabis. I see it. There's many similarities for me. It has been outlawed, junk science. There's medical. We have medical marijuana. We have it for recreation. The whole world is beginning to look at it differently. We've legalized in 8 states. Canada's going to legalize it. And the whole country, Uruguay has. And so is there something we can learn from that? It went from demonized to now it's seen very differently. And I know within the sort of nicotine community, there are people who say, we don't want to medicalize it for lots of reasons. Then there's people saying we do want to. And so I just want to put that out there, see what people think.
Very good.
The next question.
Gentleman at the back, please. Yeah, at the back, hang on. Been waiting very patiently.
Hi, my name is Mark, and I'm from Germany, from the German Vapers Association. I'm the first time here. We see a lot of people from the consumer side. So I see a lot of people from the science side, and as well as from the industrial side. And my question was, what about a delegation of governments and a delegation of public health decision makers? Are they here, and why not?
Okay. We'll maybe address that to Jerry. Over there, and then down at the front, and then we'll come back. No.
Nice quick questions.
Okay, nice quick question. So we've talked a lot about e-cigarettes and vaping here, and we've highlighted today the different products, many of which are non-combustible, which are reduced harm. So my question is, thinking about the global burden of smoking, what are the challenges and maybe the obligations from each of our stakeholder groups to address the global smoking burden in areas where e-cigarettes are, for the foreseeable future, going to be very difficult to get market penetration from?
Yep.
All right. Who down there is his turn. Definitely his turn. Okay. Quick question. That's it. And then then we'll do you, and then that's it.
I'm Michael Joseph. First experience for me here in terms of harm reduction and great learning opportunity. What I learned that we are here to reduce the harm. However, I've also observed that how do we generate further evidence that we stand to reduce really harm in the long term and to strengthen the health status.
And then there was a gentleman there, please, and then we'll get some answers. You can pick and choose which ones you answer.
Some of these might have to feed into our next session, policy and politics.
I live in Brazil, and in Brazil the sales of e-cigarettes are banned. So what can be done, and by who, when the government doesn't want to start a debate around the subject?
Okay. It's a good question. Okay, views on those questions about cannabis, about politics?
Yeah. I'll start with the cannabis. The cannabis, one of the, I think, determining points in changing the whole aspect about cannabis was identifying medical uses for cannabis. And I think the same would happen with nicotine if we were able to identify. And we already have some preliminary evidence, but unfortunately there's not much research on it. If we were able to identify medical usage for nicotine, like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease, then I think the whole discussion about nicotine is going to change at a much faster rate. But I think we are far from seeing this because there is no real commercial interest to identify medical usage of nicotine. It's not in the interest of the pharma industry in the same way that it was and it has been and it is even now for cannabis. That's really unfortunate because if to get the money needed to identify such medicinal uses, you need to have people willing to invest because they will have a profit from it. And right now it's really difficult. Going back to research, of course, we will always need more research to mainly accurately quantify the level of risk reduction of these products and, of course, to assess the population effects, which is much more complex because you need to identify use by non-smokers and so on. But this will never stop, you know. We must be able, as healthcare and public health professionals, we must be able to inform the society and the regulators about what is known until now. This endless debate of we don't know enough, we don't have enough evidence, we are not 100% sure. Yes, we will never be 100% sure. We will always look for more evidence and more evidence. But that's not information that smokers deserve or need. Smokers need to know what's happening with me when I smoke compared to what's going to happen with me when I switch to a less harmful alternative. So the debate is between continue smoking and using something else. We need to tell them what we know until now. We don't even need to recommend anything. Just give them a balanced view and let them decide.
Let me get an answer on the how do you get things moving in Brazil from Jeannie? Okay, and then we'll do Kgosi and
Brazil. One of the things that I find is when you talk about harm reduction to governments that are tobacco growing countries such as Brazil, there's almost like a fear that if you move to e-cigarettes or vaporizing, that it's going to, you know, be a real problem for the economy, which is based on tobacco in many aspects. I found that one of the things that Indonesia, India perhaps, is that you say, look, harm reduction in tobacco is not just e-cigarettes. In fact, there's three sort of major products in the market at the moment. There's the heat not burn, there's Swedish snus, and there's e-cigarettes. So you say to them, two of those are coming from tobacco. Don't be afraid to go down this route. You can still have your workers and have everyone, you know, growing tobacco for that purpose. At least it starts to get an interest. And I think in Brazil, that could be the way to start. Once you start going down that track, then, you know, the benefits of e-cigarettes and vaping would come as well. In Indonesia, just recently, exactly the same situation, and they found that discussion very helpful. So, and just one thing on cannabis, I think I totally agree that cannabis is a future thing and is fantastic in what it can do. But I go back to that point that I raised at the beginning. Nobody should think that governments are just going to give up this huge amount of revenue that they get from tobacco taxation like that. There's going to have to be a transition. Maybe tax on cannabis or sugar or something else is going to be the answer.
Let's have a view from them. We'll pick up
just quickly. I think cannabis is just catching up. Combustible cigarettes have always been legalized, and people have used them for pleasure. It's only now that cannabis is being legalized, so it's playing a catch-up game. But it's also got psychotropic effects, which is slightly different. So cannabis is a much more complex compound which produces chemicals that have undesired effects. And in some communities, it's used for those undesired effects. They are using it for the psychotropic element. The issue about Brazil is just an industry issue. And everybody protects their industry. I mean, I sit outside. The snus ban was industry protection. The fact that in the UK, there are harm reduction advocates, but there are one-arm bandits, e-cigarettes only. It's an industry protection mechanism. They're not talking about snus, which has 50 years of epidemiological evidence. So everybody protects, because the issue of addiction is that all of us are addicts. Human beings, we are addicts of one form or another. Just choose your addiction carefully. I mean, governments are addicted to taxes, etc., and all of us will protect our own interests. But there are trade issues that we are not talking about, where people are...
Do you want to give us a view on the global point? You know, how
the
most
global
of the
point
world's
is that...
focus are in developing or middle-income countries.
Well, if you look at the issue where most countries started banning e-cigarettes, part of the trigger factor was the position of the WHO.
Yeah.
So if you don't go to the source of where people get their information, you're still going to have those problems. Okay. And part of the solution is speaking truth to power and correcting the views of the WHO and accepting that there will be trade issues and different economies will go for different products depending on the strength of their economy, job situation, and tax revenue.
Greg, do you have anything to say on it, add on this? No. Okay, so let's there's a follow-up point from Jacques.
Yeah, Jacques Leuzec.
We'll shift our focus.
Just a short comment on your point, Jeannie. You should not exclude vaping when you talk to government about tobacco growers, because we still need nicotine from tobacco.
Yeah. Okay. It mostly comes from tobacco dust, though. So. All right, I just want to slightly reorientate the discussion. I feel we can, I mean, we'll take whatever questions you want to put, but I'd like to shift the emphasis now a bit towards what's the policy environment need to look like for this, so we can discuss, you know, maybe some of the things that are coming up in the States that Greg started his talk with, reducing nicotine in cigarettes. Does that make sense? Is it sensible? You know, what is the right thing to do if you're a policymaker working in this sphere? But let's carry on with so if you could think about questions along those lines, that would be great. Let's carry on taking questions from the floor. Roberto. It's on.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes. Roberto Sussman, Provapeo, Mexico. Also close to Brazil. There is middle-income countries, especially Latin America, as a sort of boundary of harm reduction. And we really face an upward battle here with the authorities are not listening. It is very hard for us to get any media coverage. We're subjected to media attacks by, and I'll say it openly because the organizations themselves also recognize, Bloomberg, Holy Bloomberg. He's funding these organizations, and these organizations have a very complicated modus vivendi with the our local authorities. I'm not going to say that they are also funded by Bloomberg, they're not. But they have this is for sociological work to understand. The WHO, together with Bloomberg, and our health organizations are very interconnected. And we're really facing an upward struggle here as consumers. And here I would like to ask for help. This is a different problem, for example, for a vaping organization in Europe. For example, in France. If in France somebody, there is some media saying nicotine is worse than heroin, then people in France, they can ask Jacques, and Jacques is an expert. But in Mexico, we are helpless, and in Brazil as well, because I can reply to these medical authorities and say, no, that's not true. But then they will say, who are you? You are just a consumer. Here, this doctor from the university or from the National Institute of Respiratory Diseases is saying that nicotine is like heroin and that vapor is toxic. So this is the expert which will be consulted. So we really need some support from countries that have medical people in the medical profession, because our argument is, it is not me, a consumer, who is saying something.
Okay. Can I just ask, maybe, Sarah, if you don't mind, in responding to, I think the NNA have been an example in the UK, the land of,
Thank you.
vaping enthusiasm, how you started to be involved in creating the advocacy voice and working with agencies like the NCSCT?
Wow.
Because I think it's just important. We know what you do now, but how did you start and maybe...
How did you defeat Bloomberg?
I mean, that's such a huge question. I mean, it was down to the passion of consumers. I came from... I mean, we started with a battle with the EU because it suddenly became very apparent that everything was going to be banned. And so suddenly there was this huge resource of vaping enthusiasts who banded together. But our problem was communication, because we were just a rabble on Twitter. So we had to get organised. So we basically set NNA up. But that's not to say that NNA doesn't have problems of communication. So although we work with PHE, we work with NCSCT to help with their courses for using e-cigarettes in cessation, a couple of weeks ago, the World Health Organization, and I was really interested in Kgosi's comments on the World Health Organization, blacklisted us. So, believe me, South Africa is not alone in not being able to communicate with the World Health Organization. I've been very pleased at this conference to see so much talk about pleasure and the cultural position of tobacco within communities. And I would really like to see this conference in future bring that forward. And I would really like a whole session on the World Health Organization, because I think we underestimate the damage that particular organization can do to harm reduction.
Very good. Very good. Right. Let's have a comment from here, and then one at the back there, please. The guy next to you. So you, and then you.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I'm Ace from Thailand, which evidently became the worst country to live in if you are a vapor, unanimously last night. I kind of agree. We have raised a bit of questions about the policymakers, like Mark just said, and Roberto also mentioned it. It's very difficult for the authority, especially the Ministry of Public Health, to listen to us. We have tried it, and not for us, some major universities and also major TV channel and major media have set up appointment for open debate. We went, they didn't show up, they turned off their cell phone, they disappeared for 2 days without trace and things like that, which is very difficult. So, okay, right now in this room, we kind of agree that we have a safer solution to nicotine, rethinking nicotine and things like that. And also, smoking is bad, so we need some replacement. We all agree on that. But the next step that we are looking for is what kind of help, especially from a country like from Asia, from Southeast Asia, and from South America and things like that. What kind of help will be getting out of this kind of forum and conference? Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. All right, and a point at the back there. Yeah, go.
Hi, I'm Bengt Wiberg from Sweden, and a tobacco harm reduction advocate for EU for snus. But I am also an MBA, and there's been a lot of talk here about losing out government revenues if people stop smoking. Being an accountant, if there is a credit entered in your books, there is also a debit. So I tried to find out, it took me several hours, the revenues from cigarette tax in Sweden was about 7 billion Swedish krona, 700,000 euros. The cost of smoking-related sicknesses, healthcare cost, and indirect cost for production losses for people getting lung cancer, staying away from job. That is $30.5 billion. So the tax on cigarettes and snus, the tax is actually higher on snus than cigarettes. So transferring from deadly product like smoking to e-cigarettes or snus can still bring in tax revenues, while the debit side of the accounts will dramatically fall. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So we have some comments?
Let's get views on tax.
Okay.
Is it right to tax vaping products for those kind of reasons? Does it bind the government into a more supportive position, or do you simply make it less attractive to switch? What is the appropriate tax regime?
And also, if I could just add on to that, bearing in mind the presentations we've had this morning about some of the poorest smokers, we need to keep these products, you know, a viable alternative. So, considering that.
One of the main motives for a smoker to switch is price difference. And unfortunately, with the exception of snus, which is a very cheap product to produce in the same way as tobacco cigarettes, all the other harm reduction products like e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products, they are much more expensive to produce by definition because they have electronics, they are much more complicated than a tobacco cigarette or than snus. So it's creating, taxing these products is creating a competitive disadvantage for this product, and it's counterproductive because it is a motivation against making the switch. Snus also. People who are smoking and want to switch to snus, if snus is becoming more expensive than cigarettes, fewer people will make the switch. So the benefit is going to be much less. I think that taxing these products in the same way as tobacco cigarettes or trying to get back the lost revenue from the reduction in tobacco cigarette sales is a very dangerous pathway. First of all, it's not really acceptable from a public health standpoint, but even from a financial standpoint, listen, over the last 5 decades, life expectancy has grown by 30 years, and countries have to provide pensions for many more years. Well, they adjusted. The same way is going to happen eventually if they lose the tobacco tax. I think we are over-exaggerating by discussing about this huge problem of losing tobacco revenues. There has been many instances in the past where the financial budgets had to change dramatically, not in a short period of time, but over time, and the governments adjusted. The same thing is going to happen here. And there is no need to punish, because in my opinion, it's punitive to add a tax in these products, not only for the products, it's punitive for smokers, and especially for the low socioeconomic class of smokers.
I'd like to get a view from a giant tobacco company that sells mainly cigarettes. What's your view on what the tax regime should be, Greg?
Well, I do think that I would even broaden it beyond that, just to say that
Don't dodge the question, though, while you're broadening.
Sorry.
Don't be a politician.
I think it's an incredibly complicated issue, right? That there are reasons to want to make sure that that as we're looking at harm-reducing products, that they are that the tax levels there are not disincenting people to move to or try those products. And so, what I was going to say by broadening it was that you asked the question earlier about what's the right policy framework. We've had this example, but I think this speaks to the complete complexity of how to make progress. You also asked a question earlier about why are we not moving as quickly, or what are the reasons that are causing this to take as long as it is. And it's because all of these individual issues, whether it be how to tax these products, or whether it be how to create the viable pathways with clear rules to get there, what data is needed to generate to get to a claim, how do we improve the lack of information and lack of communications that are out there, whether there should be product standards on combustible products. All of those issues have to be considered, whether there should be flavor restrictions when we know that flavors may play a role from a harm reduction perspective, yet there are legitimate concerns from a youth perspective. All of those need to be taken into account and addressed almost at the same time, which is really how the FDA has positioned things as a comprehensive package. And the ability to do any one of those issues is complicated, let alone the idea of doing them all as a complete package.
Do you think tax, in addition to sales tax, like an excise duty, should be applied to e-cigarettes?
Well, I think ideally we would have low or no taxes on those products to encourage folks to move to them.
Let's get views from...
Well, I think, Clive, if there's differential harm, there should be differential taxation. But that's the problem. And when you look at what's happening at WHO, people are framing it that e-cigarettes are just as dangerous, if not more dangerous. And because of that, they don't qualify for differential taxation. So the key issue is about getting the WHO to accept harm reduction and to accept the fact that non-combustible products are less harmful than combustion. That will then force the governments to have a differential taxation. In South Africa, smokeless tobacco is not taxed the same as combustible tobacco. So they've always known that. And it's about not losing the argument about the fact that those that are not combusted are less harmful. And the governments would then be forced to look at them differentially so that uptake can be improved.
Okay, let me...
I do have some. I think it's absolutely imperative that price and tax are taken into consideration in this area. Absolutely. Harm-reduced products should have zero tax or be zero rated or have the lowest amount of possible tax at all. The issue that I was raising was not in relation to that. It is that if you are going to, the evidence on this from the scientific side and everything, governments will, they will have to believe that. Where the issue is how they are going to make that transition. And I know, Konstantinos, yes, they do sort of move over time with most things, but most things are not tobacco. And there's 3 products generally that have excise tax: alcohol, tobacco, and petroleum. They're the 3 sin sort of things. And this is where, when government economies are based, many of them, on a huge chunk of that revenue, it's going to have to be replaced by something. It's going to have to come from somewhere else. And even though populations will go up and these sorts of things will happen, I was raising it in the context. It is a very, very important factor for bringing this and bringing about what we want, that we cannot forget in terms of doing it. I think everyone's right on this, but it's the elephant in the room, taxation.
Let's have another comment.
But people should switch for the health benefits.
Yes.
Not for the tax.
Ash from New Nicotine Alliance Australia. My question is about, you wanted to favour questions about policy. It's about regulatory capture and how we get those regulatory settings right. How do we ensure that no particular product is favoured? How do we ensure that the safety testing standards aren't so high that current players in the market are excluded at the expense of bigger players? How do we ensure that consumers and retailers are included in that?
Really good question. So views there essentially on what does proportionate regulation look like? How do you stop the regulation being so aversive that it bends the entire market out of shape or maybe favours particular companies or particular product lines? Any views on that?
I think we already have such a regulation. I think the EU regulation, with some disadvantage, of course, is a perfect example of having something reasonable that is sustainable for most, if not all, the current players in the market. It has resulted in a very small reduction in availability. There was a reduction in availability of different products, but not really great. I don't think that it created any problem. There are some drawbacks, some unnecessary restrictions and so on, but it is something that works. It has set some minimum quality standards. It can be, all the manufacturers can comply. financially, can comply in terms of logistics, and it has worked. To be honest, not for snus, I'm talking about e-cigarettes, the TPD about e-cigarettes. I will talk about snus. I'm using EU regulation for e-cigarettes as an example in all the countries that I'm visiting of having a very strong basis when they want to regulate the products. For snus, there is only one sentence. I think that the situation in the European Union with snus is one of the biggest public health scandals ever being done for any subject related to health.
Okay.
It's the only product with so much long-term epidemiological human data that they continuously deny to accept.
I think the reason is to create some product standards so that there's no commercial advantage to any particular product that is deemed a harm reduction product. So that whether you're a snus, a heated, an e-cigarette, it's all kind of considered as a category of reduced harm, and then consumers can decide which one works for them. I just think it's really important to have standards so that you don't have only e-cigarettes are allowed, or only, and snus is banned, or only heated tobacco is allowed. These sorts of things have to not emerge into regulatory models. It has to be consumers decide what works for them. So I think to avoid regulatory capture, product standards or categories that are as broad as possible at the first instance.
Okay.
The regulator,
let's let Greg go first and then you can finish.
The regulator must just create minimum standards.
Okay.
That then makes it a level playing field.
And I think they should be able to identify where is the value to the consumer. When we do this regulation, where is the value to the consumer? And a lot of the EU directive basically fails that test because it's either pointless or harmfully intrusive. Anyway, Greg, over to you.
I was just going to say, I thought you asked a very good question. Somebody made the point earlier that there's a good array of stakeholders that are here in the room. You mentioned a few others that need to have input into the process. Speaking from a U.S. regulatory perspective, I'm sure it's analogous to other countries as well. We have a very deliberative regulatory policymaking process, and I think we just need to encourage as many different stakeholder groups as possible to really avail themselves of every opportunity along those processes to provide their perspective and make sure that they're explaining how a particular proposal would impact them, and really getting that information in for the record and in for consideration in order to get a balanced set of regulations at the end of the day.
Okay. So we'll take some more questions.
Charlie, a quick one from Charlie, since he's got the mic, and then we'll come down.
Are we spending too much time? Are we spending too much time blaming others? Is it time for a bit of introspection and self-analysis?
Here, here.
Yeah, okay. In what sense are we to blame, Charlie? What's your point?
Well, I could talk for a very long time, but information. What information is being provided? What does working together truly mean?
Okay.
Okay, next questions?
Point down just here. Do you want to speak?
And then
stick your hand up or he won't be able to see you.
Alex wanted to put your hand right up. Alex, Louise?
Thank you.
Quick points.
Yes, I'm very brief. My name is Ernst Kroman, I'm from Austria. What I find it politically, because you wanted something political interesting, is the combat readiness of all involved group. When we look at the producers, we look at the activists. Also in this group, we have people with fire in their eyes when they're talking about e-cigarettes, saying every else is NRT is for nothing. Could you comment on this? I think it does not. We have such a huge cigarette market, and I guess there is a share for everyone.
Let's take that as a point, and then we'll
go to Alex and Louise. Louise had her hand up. The people that haven't, we're coming into the last few minutes. The people that haven't asked questions. No.
There's lots of questions over there.
Okay. Sorry.
Since quick points, you've already made one.
No, Alex. We said Alex first. No.
Okay, say it again. Just come on.
Since WHO is so important on all subjects we're discussing here, there is a representative of the institution here, and if it's not, were they invited? If they were, why they didn't came?
Okay. Jerry, we had a question earlier. Who's okay? You don't want to say that. Okay, go to
about government representative.
Let's government representative. I'm sure they've always tried to get as many people along to be as inclusive as possible. Hasn't always proved possible. Alex.
should e-cigarettes be regulated by health organisations, health regulatory organisations, or by consumer protection organisations?
Okay. Where's the mics? So Louise had a question, and this gentleman over here has had his arm really high for a really long time. So Louise, can you keep your hand up so they can see you?
Guys, come on.
There's one question here with
Charlie Perrault from French Federation, Professional Federation, FIVAP. Those standards exist in France, in UK. Actually, the CEN is working on standards, and the ISO too. So the standards does exist. And the Brazil, the organization, the standard organization of Brazil, by the French standard for information. And they ask to AFNOR how many for the standard, and if it's possible to cross the data, the value, and all of the requirements that France and UK work since 2014.
I think it's just well worth pointing out the French have done excellent work on setting standards through the AFNOR body, and those may get generalized into a European and maybe an international standard, and that could point to the future direction of regulation in this area. So last point.
So Louise.
Louise Ross, UK. Is there anything more that we could be doing to support countries where vaping is not only not tolerated, but is actually punished?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so do we ask the panel?
Let's ask the panel. I have an answer to that.
Okay.
The problem, as others have said, starts with WHO. WHO makes a virtue of prohibitions, and a lot of those countries, the policymakers in those countries, want to be recognized and rewarded by WHO. And I think that's basically the core of the problem. And until WHO changes its approach, we'll be stuck with this kind of virtue signaling behavior from uncritical policymakers.
Okay, to answer your question, Alex, should e-cigarettes be regulated as consumer products or as for health departments? My personal view would be consumer. They are consumer products. They're lifestyle products. They should take into consideration health issues, but the regulator should be product and product standards. In relation to your question, Louise, I really go back to the obligation of a government to implement tobacco control strategies, including harm reduction, and in harm reduction, that includes e-cigarettes. And I think most countries in the world have that legal obligation, but choose to forget it. I know it's an international hook, but they bring out so many other things on where they use the FCTC as being this is why something has to be. So why not use that as this is why it has to be?
I'm going to close up now. I'd just like a few seconds from, do you want to respond to that one? And then I want like 30 seconds take-out message from each of the panel.
Yeah, I think the small complication is the nicotine itself. And that is considered a poison in some countries because it has toxic doses, and you'll need to look at a different authority in terms of regulating the nicotine.
Okay.
No, I'm talking about the liquid.
We're ready to wrap up now. I just want a few seconds from each of you. Your take-out message. You're talking to a politician. What do you want them to understand about rethinking nicotine? What's the thing you want them to think differently about nicotine? Start with Konstantinos. Quickly, really like 30 seconds.
I think there's a problem of ideology and a dogmatic approach. I fully agree with everyone and with you that the WHO is the big source of the problem for many countries, most of the countries mentioned here, Thailand, Southeast Asia in general, India, Latin America. It's a tough battle, but I think, and experiencing what I saw yesterday in the conference in Madrid, I think that we shouldn't be here really. We should be at these conferences. We should expose these people to a different perspective. I think we can change their minds. The problem is that they have never heard of anything different from what they receive and they accept from the WHO or from the Bloomberg Foundation or from groups like this.
Okay.
That's a big problem.
Okay. Okay, so that's a big message. Don't come next year, go somewhere else. One from the organisers. Okay.
Well, my simple message is that we have an ethical obligation to reduce the harm component of any form of addiction, even if it's just road running.
Very good.
Okay, very good. Very concise.
Yeah, I would just say nicotine and harm reduction is it's a human right to have access to and information about products that are less harmful. And I would say nicotine is not the harmful aspect, it's the smoke. Very simple message. And that nicotine can be pleasurable, and the reason why people like it is because it can make them feel, bring them up if they need an up, and bring them down if they need a relaxation. And a simple message like that can get through.
Let's calm down about nicotine, I think is the message there, isn't it? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. And I would just say that we have a critical moment in time. We have a convergence of innovative products and new technologies. We've got consumer interest. We've got a growing science base. And certainly in the US, we've got a regulatory framework that should support making progress on harm reduction. So I would just leave you that I think we have an immediate opportunity to make progress.
And then I'd like a quick word.
Yeah, okay, so I'd just like to say, because we've spoken quite a lot about policy, and I'd like to bring it back to people, and especially we need to remember that even though we've got a real consumer voice here, there's lots of people that use these products or don't use these products that can't come here. So we need to be understanding, as Caitlin presented earlier, as Helen has, and Francis, the lives of the people that we're impacting when we present this research and when we disseminate it and when we communicate it.
And I'd like to finish by thanking you all for the conversation this afternoon, the great questions and remarks, for everybody keeping it brief and concise. I think it was a really useful discussion. So with that, I'm going to close off this session. Thank you all very much. Give yourselves a big round of applause. It was a good time there. Okay, folks, we've got a break now for 30 minutes. No, 15 minutes, sorry. And then 15:45 with closing session in the ballroom. This is the ballroom. This is the ballroom. Sorry. Here. Okay, folks, thanks.
Have you considered that when your career's over, you're going to become a Toastmaster?